So the first couple of weeks of this class, really just a reminder of certain things. Maybe the terminology is new, but certainly nothing substantive is new. We're all familiar with the relationship between premise and conclusion because we all can reason. We all know how to do it. We all know how to make inferences and see implications. This class, to a great extent, is just working on skills that we have already developed by virtue of being educated, literate people. However, one of the things that really is difficult to do and rewarding to try to do is to keeping that argumentative structure in mind. An argument is a conclusion, which is some claim, some assertion, which is supposedly made more likely to be true or seem more likely to be true because of the premises that support it, the argument that supports it. To actually look at a real argument, and here's one in the New York Times webpage in the editorial section, the opinion pages, unsigned editorial called Tarred by Tobacco. Let's take a quick look through this and say, well, okay, this is an opinion piece. It's meant to establish a claim. Does it actually do so? Called Tarred by Tobacco. Health insurance and hospital companies and members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce find themselves in an uncomfortable situation. Now, that could be what is being argued, that they are actually in an uncomfortable situation. Publicly, these companies support policies designed to reduce smoking. But the Chamber, as Danny Hakim recently reported, has opposed anti-smoking measures around the world. So you could say that, maybe that's the whole point of the piece. Is that right there to say that health insurance companies, which are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, have a conflict of interest, I would say, because they, being health companies, oppose smoking and support policies to reduce smoking. But the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, at least in terms of its activities abroad in so-called developing countries, opposes measures that are meant to prevent smoking. The controversy appears to have surprised health-related businesses like Anthem, one of the nation's biggest health insurers, and Steward Healthcare Systems of Boston, which have executives on the board of the Chamber. Quote, if the Chamber is in fact advocating for increased smoking, we do not agree with them on this public health issue, unquote, a spokeswoman for Steward said in a statement to the Times. I'm not really sure. That's more like background. Doesn't really feel like part of an argument. Mr. Hakim's report found that the Chamber has fought tobacco packaging, restrictions on smoking in public spaces, and taxes on cigarettes in countries like the Philippines, Jamaica, Nepal, and Moldova. It has also pushed for provisions in trade agreements that could be used by tobacco companies to demand compensation for anti-smoking laws countries adopt. Okay, so giving us background, filling us in on the activities of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in terms of trying to influence legislation and regulation of tobacco in developing countries like the Philippines, etc. Some members of the Chamber are probably not aware of every lobbying campaign the organization is running around the world, and most members focus on the issues they care about most. For American health insurers and hospitals, tobacco use in foreign companies is probably a very low priority relative to, say, the healthcare reform law. After all, most of these businesses do not sell insurance or run hospitals abroad. Okay. Again, kind of background saying, well, this may not be a high priority for U.S. healthcare companies that are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce because they have other concerns. By contrast, selling cigarettes in foreign countries, especially fast-growing developing nations with young populations, is a high priority for big tobacco companies. These businesses have played a big role in getting the Chamber to act on their behalf, including by disingenuously characterizing their fight against policies on cigarette packaging as a fight to protect intellectual property rights. So far, we have a feeling of where this is going, but we don't really have a notion of what the overall claim or conclusion of the argument is yet. The World Health Organization estimates that developing countries will account for 70% of the 8.4 million people who die because of smoking-related illnesses by 2020. Okay, again, that's a factual statement not what's being argued. What is the overall? One anticipates that last little fact will be the support, be a premise supporting the overall conclusion. But we haven't really found it yet, that overall conclusion. Now that it is clear what kind of pro-tobacco advocacy the Chamber is carrying out, the organization's members, particularly in the healthcare industry, ought to speak out. Ding, 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 there it is. That is that last part. Okay, there. That's clearly the claim, the overall conclusion of the argument. Do they want their names associated with such a blatant attempt to stop governments in developing countries from enacting sensible public health policies? So that last question, of course, there is a rhetorical question. It's not a true question. It's a statement. Of course they don't want or shouldn't want their names associated with that kind of attempt. So what is highlighted there is, I think, clearly our main conclusion, the overall thing that the writer of this editorial is trying to argue, and that is that the organization's members, and the organization is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, particularly in the healthcare industry, ought to speak out, meaning ought to speak out against this pro-tobacco advocacy, as the editorial calls it. So if we decide, and you just have to decide, okay, that's what it's about, that's the main thing, and then the next step is to say, well, what is it that is supporting that main claim? Certainly this comes into play. The number of people from developing countries who will die of tobacco-related illness in 2020, of course, that's a forecast. 2020 hasn't happened yet. The fact that businesses in the Chamber of Commerce have, tobacco companies have used the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to fight tobacco regulations. We go back to the beginning. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has opposed anti-smoking measures around the world. Okay. So if we kind of reconstruct this argument, again, saying that this is our main conclusion, that the organization's members, especially, particularly those in the healthcare industry, ought to speak out. But we look back and say, well, what supports that conclusion? Well, the number of people who are expected to die in developing countries of tobacco-related illness, the kind of practices that tobacco companies have gotten the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to actually do. And, I would imagine, that here, again, another one of the premises or the reasons is this rhetorical question at the end. Now, you have to sort of read into that to a certain point. First of all, it's a rhetorical question, right? It's a statement that healthcare companies especially should not want their names associated with these attempts to stop governments from enacting anti-smoking policies. And the unstated, I would say, assumption is that healthcare companies that their primary mission is to promote human health, and that they shouldn't be involved in anything which is openly harmful, practices that are harmful to human health, like tobacco. So they shouldn't be involved in an organization that prevents regulation and anti-smoking campaigns and things like that. So, I think that probably is a pretty good argument. Here you have to sort of move on. Well, if the overall claim is that healthcare organizations that are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce really need to speak out about what the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is doing in terms of trying to prevent regulation of tobacco in developing countries, is it a comprehensive overall argument? No, it's a short little punchy opinion piece. But it seems to me that it does a fairly good job in arguing, at least that these companies should not be involved in that sort of thing.